Welcome one, welcome all to the Politics of Cinema. On this show, we believe films are never neutral. There's a political as well as artistic message captured in each film, sometimes on purpose, sometimes on accident, but either way, we're on the lookout for all of it. My name is Aaron Spears.
And my name is Isaac Miller. And on this episode, we are beginning our summer series, The History and Politics of the Blockbuster, Part 1, the 70s.
There is a time and place that is commonly associated with kicking off the blockbuster, and if you just do a quick Google search, it's always Jaws, Star Wars, 1970s, and that took a minute to dive into because when you look at some basic box office receipts, you're like, is it really the 70s?
Well, part of it is if you look at the big movies in the 70s, outside of Jaws, outside of Star Wars, and outside of the movie that we'll be looking at, Superman, the movie, it's not clear that the sort of movies that you associate with blockbusters,
right?
Like we'll talk about what blockbusters are, and it doesn't actually have to be a big special effects picture or something like that. But that's what we associate and what they've definitely totally become.
Right.
But it's like, Grease and The Godfather do not actually fit this, right?
Well, I mean, they do because they made a ton of money,
right?
So it's basically like how we want to track the evolution of this. How did we get to what we like? If you say blockbuster now, it's well, again, it's some of the same properties that been there the whole time. Star Wars, but then you get into Marvel, you get into Disney, you get into Pixar. How did we get to the blockbuster that we have now? Because also, like in the 1970s, you see the development of the blockbuster like as a seasonal thing, which is kind of interesting. But so I guess it's a good place to start. Definition wise, what are we talking about when we talk about a blockbuster? Is it just a film that makes a shitload of money at the box office? Parentheses, usually in the summertime. I think the box office focus is a pretty clear-cut definition, right?
I think the box office focus, I think the seasonality. So part of it is, and we talked about this, there are other big movies.
Mm-hmm.
But the model is different. Because, if you're talking about the 30s, it's like a road show that happens over 4 years. We're not talking about that.
Right.
Like the era of the blockbuster is it makes that money in the summer. Right? Or it makes that money over the first, few months.
Well, I would say it can be in the summer. Like there is like a seasonality in my mind to it. Like it's the summer blockbuster season, right? That's when the studios put out their, what is the concept? The tentpole movie. Like that's the one that's going to be there in the summer. You don't put out a new Fast and Furious movie in like February or November. Although you could at a certain point, those will just make money.
Right.
Like Marvel's slate is too big to only have movies come out in the summer. So you have blockbusters during the quote unquote off season now too, outside of summer.
Yeah. Well, and you see this happening, right? Like you see it happening with, I was, some of the reading I was doing for this, they already sort of talk about the seasonality by the early 80s, or they talk about it right away. The summer is the time you want it. And they're talking about maybe pushing a movie to Christmas, which is not quite as good, but is similar. It's like that's literally the pattern we have today.
It really is, but like there is. So it's interesting when I was looking this up in the early 70s, the holiday season was a sought holiday season, meaning December going into January. That was a sought like that was almost the precursor to the summer model. Like they had the model there in the holiday season. You have Love Story comes out in the holiday season 1970. Poseidon Adventure is a holiday season film 72. So that's kind of interesting. Like the template was there, but it was the holiday season. They just hadn't done it in the summertime. Why wasn't the summertime looked at before Jaws? Well, it was thought of like the vacation time.
Right.
This is when people travel. This is not when you have to go to the movies to see something. And I think when we get to a few comments on Jaws, like there's a specific reason why that worked there. But we have a few other things that go into this definition. It gets to be the idea of oversized budgets. The average budget in the 70s is not anywhere remotely close to what we've got nowadays. But you did have movies, again, like Jaws or whatever, that like were a larger budget. Oversized compared to standard average production costs in Hollywood. There's the idea of promotional campaigns, the amount of money put into getting the word out about a movie, which is kind of hard from our point of view because eventually during this series, when we go up to the modern times, we will have been alive for some of these, so we will remember what the promotional campaigns were. Specifically within promotional campaigns, I wanted to mention like the toy market because that's a big deal with Star Wars, right? Eventually.
Right.
Toys and the merchandising. Well, in doing some research, I found a bunch of James Bond toys that were being advertised.
Get your 007 secret agent pen and disappearing vapor paper separately or packaged with a 007 secret agent ring and ID bracelet. You'll get a bang out of it by American character.
So this series of toys was all on the Sean Connery James Bond. So this is 1960s ads for toys for what is, I don't think, a children's film, but James Bond are, they're PG, if not G-rated action films. So I guess kids would have been seeing them. I like gadgets, and as a kid, if I was around in the 60s, I probably would have been interested in a James Bond movie.
I mean, in some ways, does the blockbuster also track the kidification
Yes, I think
of
it did.
popular culture?
Yeah.
I mean, in the 70s,
Maybe not in the 70s.
well, I think the 70s, since we're beginning this transition, that hasn't happened yet. But I think even just in some of the stuff I saw about Superman, like, I'm trying to remember, but I think that comes up. Like, who's the assumed target audience?
Right.
And who do you actually end up wanting to get, right?
Well, it's still a PG film, the first Superman, because PG-13 isn't invented yet. So they didn't go R, obviously. But no, if you think about that way from the blockbuster point of view, and what you're doing is you're aiming for the widest possible audience. So everything is family friendly. Like, go back to the 60s again, you've got some of the biggest films in the 60s were big musicals. My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music is huge. 4.5 years in release, gets up to like $70 million. Those are not risque, Rated R wasn't around yet. That didn't come out till like 68 or so. But yeah, these are not risque movies. You're going for everyone can go see this. And I think that mentality holds through the 70s.
So to what degree does the blockbuster model, as it sort of evolves and come about, become the stabilizing force for Hollywood as you move out of like the 70s sort of auteur era?
I think it's the Superman Star Wars, because they're like, I didn't get into it for this bit of research, but you have like Gulf and Western buying Paramount. You have international conglomerates buying up the studios in the 70s, and Hollywood is generally believed to be like financially stable because it wasn't for a while there by the late 70s.
Right. So you have consolidation, but then they're expecting more regularized returns on bigger productions. Like and fast. Part of it is this is fast turnover time, right? These
Faster, for sure.
These movies make a lot of money real fast. You have to put a lot into them, and there's so part of my fascination is, in my mind, in my life, I associate the blockbuster with action movies.
Yep.
And with big special effects films. And that is absolutely what they've become completely. But when we're talking about the 70s or even the 80s, that isn't necessarily the case.
Well, I don't think it's the emphasis for the movie. Like, there's great storytelling and filmmaking going on as well.
Yes.
Not in service of this great special effects sequence, the way you might get with like Independence Day or whatever we get to the later ones.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you could say, so that's a question, I mean, we'll get into with Superman. I mean, I think part of it is, if we say that what establishes the model is Star Wars, Superman, and Jaws, special effects play a very important role in all of them, at least two of them.
Well, I was going to say, even with Jaws, though, it's like the lack of working special effects. It is part of the story of Jaws, right?
That shark looks fine.
Well, but it was supposed to be more of like a Roger Corman-esque, like there's a lot of shark in it.
Right.
So the lack of a working practical effect kind of, rewrote history, as it were, for Jaws.
Makes a better horror movie.
And it makes it better. Yeah. So, but then also, I think we have already kind of mentioned it, but it was one of the other bullet points here is like the crazy box office performance. Like, you have, like we mentioned, Sound of Music, 4.5 years in release, roadshow style. Over that course of time, I mean, it still was like number one for like weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. But it was a slow trickle over 4.5 years up to like a $70 million mark in its initial release. Once you hit like a Jaws, you realize, it quickly makes back its money and just keeps going and doesn't stop. And then you get that with Superman and you get that with Star Wars. So like the fact that there's a crazy box office performance becoming a news story in the general culture is part of that what makes a blockbuster, I think, as well. Part of the definition we're looking at.
So, I want to be able to relate this back to not just the politics of the industry itself, but to the politics represented in the films. I'm not sure that's as easy to do with the blockbuster concept on its own, as opposed to different strands of the genre. Like, when we talk about the 80s, we're going to talk about muscle man action movies. We've done a little bit of that before, but we've done it with the lower end of the scale.
Right. Yeah. The Chuck Norris scale.
The Chuck Norris scale, not ones that are like major cultural forces.
Right.
But obviously, they're very important.
Yeah.
And just as the Marvel movies and everything today actually are very reflective of political moments and are contradictory due to the blockbuster format
Mm-hmm.
in what they can actually do. But I'm not sure. I mean, they say something about the political economy of the industry. They say something about all those. I'm not sure if any of them you can say that blockbusters, as they evolve into what they become, can be said to make one political statement.
I don't think it can be one unified political statement other than this. So I don't even know if this is a statement. It was a question I wrote down in my notes as I was thinking about this. The
Mm.
fact that it relies on making a shitload of money, does that kind of inadvertently make the blockbuster, not as a genre, but as a concept, kind of accidentally political because it requires financial success, which means there are people that are not supporting, but like participating in making that. Like it almost becomes this weird like capitalistic game where like, hey, make sure you go see Endgame a second or third time because we gotta make all of us have to make this the biggest movie of all time and beat Avatar or beat Titanic. And it's a weird game it ends up playing more modern day, I think, with the audience. Like you're participating in this historic thing via giving a gigantic corporation more and more of your money.
So here's the thing: is that gets into fan culture and the complexity of the creation of personal identity out of fandom, which is considerably older than blockbuster films. Like, I mean, the prototypes for these things. You look at like from the pulp magazines of like I don't know the 20s and 30s to comic books to and as it spreads into various forms into what we understand as modern geek culture, which is the 80s are very transformative to that. The 90s are all these things. It moves along in time, and now it's like a dominant cultural force in so many ways. That I think is something that is co-productive and deeply integrated. I mean, obviously, Star Wars is incredibly important in this,
I
and
was gonna say Superman too, which we'll be talking about here shortly. Like
and
that. So is it maybe like the seeds of it start in the film industry in the late 70s?
I think in the film industry, yes.
Okay.
So I think for the film industry, it's going to come then. I think Star Wars is really important to that. Superman, I think Superman's an IP issue, right? So like is a pre-existing IP. So Superman, the fan culture around that is based on the fact that he'd been around for it's kind of amazing to think about this. Just 40 years previously and had spearheaded like comic book culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if the movie itself quite functions that way. It has a huge nostalgia cachet for people who saw it at the time. And if you ever talk to people about it, like it's a very big deal. And if you
Right.
get like public reviews anywhere there is it's like, oh, I remember seeing this then, and it was a very big deal. But I think what you're talking about is something that we should track. It's deeply integrated with what becomes the dominant form of blockbuster by
Mm-hmm.
now, but isn't necessarily, Point Break is a blockbuster, but that's not the issue.
Right. Yeah. These are also kind of more things that this kind of like definitional checklist I had of blockbuster was more what I think of it now and trying to see do these things apply as the concept began. And some do and some don't. I think so. We'll see how when they start to pop up over the course of looking at the different decades.
I'm having a lot of trouble not doing that because I know it's a dangerous method for approaching any subject because you're going to be looking for something and looking for it backwards.
Right.
Trying to find, and it's like it's a problem, but we're sort of doing it out of default because we're trying to, this is sort of the modern industry, right? The other thing, I mean, when you're talking about are there necessary stakeholders, right? I think when you have a movie that big, it has to be bland, but like okay, let's track this a little bit. If you're thinking of code era Hollywood,
Yeah.
the stakeholder, let's say the government, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
is just as deeply enmeshed. And films are more propagandistic, not necessarily more propagandistic than like an 80s blockbuster. I think more propagandistic than today.
Yes, I think so.
By far. So in that sense, I think, it doesn't necessarily change a lot of the underlying content to have it be a blockbuster in a political sense. Like I was trying to think of like, do big blockbusters reflect the place of where our society is more because they're huge? And it's like, I don't think so.
I don't know. I think they might. It's something I want to keep my eye on because we're going to be going through eras, like I said, that we are both alive for. And I think the large budget action film of the 80s is going to be very different from the 90s because there's a different political world. I think it's one of those things, not necessarily, again, like not necessarily on purpose in the film, but it's accidentally captured. Like the way the military is portrayed in a Michael Bay film or movie in the 90s or 2000, early 2000s is going to be different than the way the military is portrayed in an 80s film with like Schwarzenegger or Stallone or something. I think.
I think, yeah, that's reflect. But I think that's those are the movies reflecting the time period. But I think that would be true. That's true if you look at the 50s and 60s.
Right. That's what I'm saying. And I think it's going to be interesting to sort of see that as it goes, but specifically just through, the concept of the blockbuster,
Right.
not like an overtly political like action film that just did okay at the box office. We're talking like the big ones that made a huge cultural impact. Like Rambo is a touchstone for people, or a shorthand to describe a certain mentality. I mean, there's cut and paste Trump images on flags of him on Rambo's body. What is unpack that for me, please? What are you saying with that?
Well, because it's going to go kick ass. I mean, I think, what's interesting, I think we were talking about doing First Blood, right? Or we were talking about doing the first Rambo movie.
Yeah, I've never seen the first one, so I have that on my 80s list.
Yeah. I'm actually not sure that's the one to focus on for an episode. I think the ones where he goes back to Vietnam or goes to Afghanistan might actually capture more of what those movies meant, which is what people usually think of when they think of Rambo, because the first one is a pretty small scale movie in sort of exploitation movie about like a veteran being like attacked when he gets back.
Right. Which I've saw like one of those movies when I was a kid on VHS, but it was a no because it was rated R. Like I was that young, so like I have no frame of reference for the Rambo universe. So I plan on tracking through a few of those. We'll see how much time I have. But
yeah, I know. I mean, basically, yeah. When Weird Al spoofs Rambo in UHF, it's not for the first one. It's for like
right
the second and third.
Yeah, and there's like it's like my child brain. I mean, my adult brain now is remembering as a child. Like all I remember is like the torture porn scenes.
Yeah.
So because that was shocking to me at the time. But anyway, yeah, it's something I know it is like you said, dangerous to look back with what I know it to be now. But that was just the way I wanted to look at it because I know how it evolved. So I kind of want to see when the different checkboxes I have for current blockbusters actually pop up along the line.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting. I think one thing that's going to come up is violence level. I mean, we talked about this once when we talked about RoboCop, which I don't remember how big RoboCop was in its year. It certainly was intended to be something like a blockbuster, right?
Yeah, it was.
And we're watching this, and it's like kids can't watch this movie.
Right, and like we said in the episode, like there were toys. There was a whole toy line, and then they developed a cartoon, so there was something kids could watch because you could probably then sell more toys. But it was hugely successful because, it created a whole spin-off universe and sequels.
Part of it is I think today you're not going to have a top range blockbuster that's at the level of a Rambo movie, probably, in terms of violence.
Right.
You save that for your John Wicks, which is like a layer down. And part of the reason that John Wick is so special right now within the industry is there's nothing else like it.
Right.
It's not even a throwback. It's like it's sort of its own thing, in a landscape that's been so homogenized at its top, at least at the top layers.
Right. It's one of those that comes along and surprises people the way that like when, I don't know, like a Mamma Mia or a specific Meryl Streep movie breaks through and then Hollywood, like every once in a while you see those articles that pop up like, oh my God, Hollywood just realized that women go to the movies. You're like, oh, stop. It's ridiculous. But yeah, there's like, oh my God, there's a room for like a really well choreographed rated R action film. Like, yeah, The Matrix was a huge hit. How many times are we going to learn this lesson, quote unquote? Well, so the last bullet point I wanted to bring up with this defining blockbuster that I'm kind of looking at, which does apply, I think, to when we get to Jaws, Star Wars, and specifically Superman, is a cultural pressure to see these big movies, usually summer movies, like we said. But like it's so big that like the box office is so big, everyone is seeing. You're like, oh my gosh, I guess. Like my reason for going to see a movie is usually like I'm interested, or it looks good, or like you recommended it to me, Isaac, or something. You know what I mean? Like the personal recommendation. But there's this interesting kind of, I don't like not bullying, but like feeling like you're culturally missing out on something if you don't go see it.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of the blockbuster. I keep wanting to say genre, and I know it's not a genre. Part of this whole blockbuster thing. I think that's one more element to it, but I did want to point out a couple first uses of blockbuster, or like in the reporting and some of the film history stuff that I was looking at. And I thought this was, I'm going to go ahead and use the word cute. In 1953, I think it was Variety or The Guardian declared 1953 a year of the box office blockbuster. And this is the cute part. 135 films in 1953, 135 grossed over $1 million individually, which, 1953, 135 films that gross, that top $1 million each. That would be something worth reporting on. Keep it in 1953 context. But like nowadays, like people would just slough that off. Like, yeah, and like, oh, so there are so there's 135 failures.
Well, okay, so inflation adjusted, that's a lot bigger.
Sure, but like we're talking, airport making 80 million, like or Sound of Music, like we said, getting up to $70 million.
All right, so that's not that long afterwards.
Right.
So that gives you a sense of the part of it is this: in the aggregate, they're doing better, probably.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, because there were more hits.
There's more hits. The hits are smaller, but there's a lot of them, and you're just putting out more movies. And later on, part of it is part of the function of all this is that as movie going becomes less of a center of the culture, you have to make it count, right?
Right. That's true too. Yeah, especially when you're looking from, audience peaked in like the late 40s at like 90 plus million a week going to the movies. So yeah, by the time we're getting into the era that we're going to be getting into here in the 70s, like is nowhere near that.
Right. No, I actually, now that I think about it, and we can look into this more, that might actually be at the heart of the political economy of this, is you can only shoot so many shots. This is your chance to get people in the seats.
Right. Which goes back to the special effects you were mentioning.
Right.
As being a thing. Oh, so genre too, we hadn't really, we kind of hinted at there, but like, yeah, you've got action, sci-fi, you've got the epics, war epics, battle epics, biblical epics. Actually, if you want to go back far enough, you got 10 Commandments in 56. That was definitely well over $1 million. Disaster films, which I do want to touch on briefly, because to me, when you and I were discussing like blockbusters in the 70s, it was like, well, we got to talk about these disaster films, right?
Right.
But all of those speak to some area of special effects. And I know nowadays when you hear special effects, a lot of times their brain will go to computer generated effects or computer generated CGI, computer generated imagery. And that's not exactly the full definition of special effects. We're also talking about practical effects. We're talking about models. We're talking about in-camera effects, lighting tricks, that sort of thing. So We're talking about the whole gamut of special effects here. But part of that is special effects are the draw for disaster films, a genre, which is a genre, unlike the blockbuster tag. It is a genre I like. And I went back and watched Airport, not talking about it because it's not a disaster film. It's a soap opera with an inverted disaster at the end. But you do have pre-Star Wars, pre-Jaws, pre-Superman. In 1974, Towering Inferno, huge success. Earthquake, 1974, huge success. Airport, 1975, came out in 1974, obviously a sequel as well, so keep that in mind. Those were all huge financial successes at the box office. And they spawned a whole rash of imitations up to, what was the one we were talking about that was a Mystery Science Theater episode? Avalanche.
Oh, man.
Later in the 70s. Like, there's a whole bunch of disaster films in the late 70s that are trash. Some of those are trash too, to be honest. But those were giant disaster movies that were also event movies. But I found it weird when I was looking them up that most of those were coming out around like the holiday season again. Towering Inferno was holiday season 74.
Man, that doesn't seem like a Christmas movie to me, but whatever.
But I think those all kicked off because Poseidon Adventure in 72 was a huge hit. So it was like, giant ensemble cast around a disaster. You have all these little individual stories. There you go. Make your movie.
It's so part of what we're looking at. You mentioned this with the 10 Commandments is proto stabs at what this is going to become.
Yeah.
And there's an evolutionary process here with some strands sort of dying out and some not. Part of it is, the disaster movie doesn't totally go away. Roland Emmerich does exist.
No, it's definitely there. And I didn't mean to say that it goes away at the end of the 70s. I just meant there's an ebb and flow to it.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely the 70s is when it happens, right?
Yeah.
As a genre, this is when it's, but part of it is as a chance to be sort of the dominant form, right? This is it, right? The 90s are also going to have our Meteor and Volcano movies.
Yeah, that's true.
The 90s, when we were sort of talking about this, and I don't know if this is true in my sort of preliminary looking at things, I feel like the 90s is going to be really a weird one.
Well, I think it's the first decade that we're going to be covering that like I was active and could get to the movies on my own. So like I watched a lot of stuff, so I was around for it, but also was around for like the marketing of it. Was working at a video store, so like it's going to be an interesting one to cover. But I'm curious once we get there, Because also, as we've said before too, decades are kind of fluid. Like this is not like this is only the 70s, then hard stop. Now the 80s start. Like this is kind of a continuous thing. We're just using the decades as an easy start and stop period to cover this.
Yeah, I mean, so well, what I mean by that is when I think of the big franchises that have survived to this day, right?
Yeah.
Only the Jurassic Park one. There's only one that comes out of the 90s that I can think of.
Right now.
Yeah, Jurassic Park.
Right.
But a whole bunch of them come out of the 80s and late 70s.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're definitely gonna be tracking that to see because, like, yeah, without looking through like the year by year lists,
It's a little hard to tell.
we will see in a couple episodes, I guess.
Is it true? Is it not?
So one of the things looking at blockbusters in the 70s, I have it in mind because one of my American film history obsessions is the new Hollywood era, late 60s into the 70s. And the common belief is like then Jaws ruined it. I probably even joked about that on the show a few times. Jaws and Star Wars ruined it because it showed the studios, hey, you can use this formula to make giant blockbuster movies and make a lot more money very quickly at the box office if you do it right and you engage the audience, which really isn't true when you look at the hard numbers. By the time you get to the 70s, supposedly the musical's dead. These big, My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, these giant 60s musicals. Even like Paint Your Wagon is always the Clint Eastwood, is it Lee Marvin musical, is looked at as like, oh my God, it's one of these giant debacles, right?
Whenever anybody mentions Paint My Way, I always think of there's a Simpsons
Yep.
Simpsons scene around that. And that's just, I will always associate. It's really,
Hey! That's a pretty sorry looking wagon you got there, mister.
I reckon it could use a coat of paint.
Well, what are we waiting for? Gonna paint our wagon, gonna paint it good. We ain't bragging, we're gonna coat that wood.
They're gonna paint that wagon, they're gonna paint it good. They ain't bragging, they're gonna coat that wood.
Ah, they're singing! They're singing, Marge! Why aren't they killing each other?
Yeah, their guns are right there.
Wait. Here comes Lee Marvin. Thank God. He's always drunk and violent.
Yeah, as soon as you mentioned, I was playing that song in my head. But that was Paramount's biggest film that year, money-wise, at the box office. Which wasn't like one of the blockbuster ones, but like it's thought of as like this giant disaster. And maybe it was based on like how much they put into it, but whatever. It was the biggest movie for them that year at the box office. I was like, oh, that's interesting. 71, Fiddler on the Roof, huge. That's a 3-hour plus, if I remember correctly, movie that did great at the box office. So it's interesting, like the common, I guess, like misconceptions of like, oh, Easy Rider's a huge hit. We got to keep making only this now. I was like, no, the other genres still flourish. There were duds, obviously, but there were also huge ones. Godfather, 72. It always kind of, that was one that I would go to as like, was it really Jaws that started it? Because Godfather makes like 100, or it eventually would make 100 million with like re-releases and everything else. Initial release, it was a blockbuster. It made a shitload of money. It was huge culturally.
I mean, here's the thing is this, if you're going to think about, cultural impact, right? I mean, it's The Godfather, right?
Right. But also we're going through this on the decades. I was trying to keep it just looking at like when it came out, not like was it discussed, because there are certain movies that would come out, don't make that much money, but are found later on home video and become cultural things. But Godfather's not one of those. Like that was out and that was a huge hit. Exorcist, 73, huge hit.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness. Nobody expected it.
Let's see what
Nobody believed it. And nothing could stop it.
Makes like $60-70 million. Again, a holiday season one. Why some studio executive was like The Exorcist, let's put that out around the holidays. I don't know, but they did, and it was a huge hit. And then obviously, that all leads up to Jaws. I did want to do a quick shout out to Mel Brooks. Blazing Saddles, huge hit. That comes out in 74. Same year as Tower and Inferno. Although Blazing Saddles, I think, was a January, February hit. So that wasn't like holiday season necessarily, but that one came out. That was a huge hit. That's a comedy. That doesn't fit the new Hollywood mold. That doesn't fit the blockbuster mold the way we think of it nowadays. But, Mel Brooks was a huge hit and actually helped get David Lynch going career-wise with giving him Elephant Man as a producer. But yeah, it was like one of those, like this, just looking at some basic box office numbers for this episode, I was like, I'm really had to recalibrate what I think about new Hollywood, and like everything was like auteur driven, and it was like that's how you made box office gold. You're like, no, but also it kind of was like you have The Godfather, that's Coppola. You have Exorcist, that's Friedkin. Like that is in there, but also you've got Towering Inferno and Poseidon Adventure and Fiddler on the Roof.
Well, these easy meta narratives don't actually work.
No, it's
They
there if you
really
cherry
don't.
pick and want to just do a quick think piece or a list. Fine,
Right. Or have a narrative, or have a hate narrative.
that's
I mean,
true.
like part of the thing about Jaws is, one, Jaws is by an auteur.
Mm-hmm.
So is Star Wars, by the way, right?
Right.
And those are both auteur movies that help to launch these sorts of things. And it's also like that movie came out in the mid-70s. It's not actually killing. I don't know. Like, I think this point has been made. Not just I think you've made it, and a lot of other people have too. Is part of it is New Hollywood ran out of juice, just like every other new whatever period in any other movie's history, movie industry's history, right?
The French New Wave hasn't lasted to this day. It happened for a bit, and then things moved on.
Right. And so part of it is about the business, but if these movies were making, right, if they were at the top of it, part of what's different about, the reason why we react to Godfather that way is because it may be actually in reality a blockbuster, but it's not the model that we're talking about.
Right.
And
that's the thing. Yes.
It's the Jaws, Star Wars, Superman model that survives.
Right.
I mean, part of it is, it's why something like The Irishman is so weird, right? Now, it's not a blockbuster in the sense that, well, one, it's just on Netflix, so this doesn't
So
help.
who knows?
Who the hell knows how much money it made in the theaters? But they spent blockbuster money on it.
For sure.
But that was a prestige move.
Right.
Which makes it weird. They're not going to do that for anyone else but Scorsese, and Scorsese can barely get that.
Yeah. Okay, actually, that's a really interesting point you brought up, because there are these movies that come up, like Jaws, for instance, or eventually you get like a Blair Witch Project. The amount of money made to produce it, so like it doesn't have to be like a Paranormal Activity. That is a blockbuster movie because it made a shitload of money at the box office, but it didn't take that much to produce. So I think some of the times those are the more wow movies, because it's not something that people are expecting to be a giant hit.
Right.
Like when you have your I'm trying to think of spectacular failures, like a John Carter of Mars or whatever, like those ones that, $200 million are sunk into it and then it makes like $10 or whatever. Like it's okay, so maybe it is one of the conditions, but it's not like the first definition.
John Carter deserved better.
Not up for discussion right now. I'm using that as my quick go-to example of like one of those failures, or like Cutthroat Island, like the big pirate movie that like ended the pirate genre, if that was even
right. No, I just got to throw it out there. I find that the dead end modern blockbusters fascinating.
Oh yeah, and I do want to kind of keep an eye out for that as we go through this, but I'm not necessarily. If there's an interesting failure, it's maybe worth mentioning, but it wasn't really the focus of what I was looking at, because it's more like, why are these such gigantic hit movies amongst the broad public as well? Because we are using that as kind of the main metric. If it makes money at the box office, that literally is how it becomes a blockbuster.
Mm-hmm.
So, but also we're assuming then that means like everybody's into it. Well, yeah, I've seen plenty of blockbusters and I was like, whatever, but I still saw it. And what is that kind of doing culturally that everyone's sharing these particular stories?
I actually, this just occurred to me when you're talking about that. What does it mean when everybody's sharing these stories? But part of it is that also goes for TV shows.
Right.
And how is that? That's definitely happened with TV shows before, right? The end of Seinfeld or whatever,
Or like Friends just had a whole like reunion thing on, I guess, HBO or something. That hasn't been on the air for how long? So like, yeah, they do have, but we're not, Isaac, I don't have the time to look into what TV was hits in the 80s as well. And I also watch the movies.
Oh, well, I don't either, frankly.
But yes, that is a thing. Yes, for sure.
So part of it is to what degree are these things actually feeding off of each other as a model of sort of like, part of it is right now we're well, you know what? I guess this is the opening episode. We're going to talk more about this, but media consolidation is going to, play an important role in a lot of it. You can saturate when you control everything.
Oh, absolutely. synergy, isn't it? Is that the word? I mean, just throughout the 80s, one thing I wrote down in my notes to look at was like all the McDonald's Happy Meal toy tie-ins that come up throughout the 80s. Although the funniest one, I guess, would probably be Mac and Me, which actually has McDonald's scene in it. But before we jump into Superman, which we get with 78, the template it's always referred to is Jaws.
There is a creature alive today who has survived millions of years of evolution without change, without passion, and without logic. It lives to kill. A mindless eating machine. It will attack and devour anything. It is as if God created the devil and gave him jaws. This is Universal's extraordinary motion picture version of Peter Benchley's best-selling novel, Jaws.
Jaws hits in 75. It comes out in the end of June. I think it's like June 20th. It ends up being number one at the box office for 14 weeks. It makes $35 million that summer. It sets an opening weekend record at the box office, pays for itself in that opening weekend, and becomes a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
Comes out in the summer. It's a blockbuster. And that whole story self-perpetuates through the media coverage. Everyone is culturally expected to go see this, but also it's played up in some of the ads and some of some of the reviews and the think pieces and the commentaries of, we're culturally experiencing a Gone with the Wind. Nobody's experienced this, in our lifetime as a movie at the theater. I mean, if you were alive in 65, 10 years earlier, you did have that with Sound of Music. It was out and released for 4.5 years. I mean, come on. But it's often referred to as like, oh, it's the first movie to, I mean, granted, it is the first movie to hit 100 million, I think, at the box office, but quickly, like we said, not the Sound of Music way. It hit it by the end of 75. It had multiple re-releases. It would spawn sequels, which we are going to be obviously taking a look at as we get farther along in charting these things. But it often gets the credit for like being a first wide release. That's how it made so much money, which isn't true. I mean, it was a wide release. It was actually supposed to be more that was pulled back by a studio executive from what I read, because they wanted it to be a little bit more scarce. Like they wanted people to have to like drive to go see this thing, become an event sort of thing. But James Bond films were going out in 500 prints at once, like same as Jaws was. Jaws opening, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was around like a 500 to 700 print release, which meant, that many screens. But you also had, the birth of the multiplex is kind of there for Jaws eventually to get released out into as well. James Bond had TV ads, the toys, like we mentioned earlier. So it almost kind of should be the James Bond model. It's just that Jaws made so much money that it becomes known as the Jaws model. So it's kind of like it became the thing. It became the model because it worked better financially.
I mean, well, that's how these things work, right? Like.
Right. No, right. So it gets the credit where you're like, well, it didn't invent it. It just was like the most successful at it initially, like at the early stages, I guess.
I mean, part of it is because the midwife of the blockbuster is Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
And it takes someone at that level. Maybe it takes someone at that level to bring it on home.
Well, as we joked, and I'm sure we're going to be mentioning quite a bit coming up here, is like it. Technically, if you look at Jaws, it's a cheap thriller paperback by Peter Benchley. It's a Roger Corman movie.
Yeah.
But, because the shark didn't work, because they couldn't have the effects they wanted to be the exploitation movie that it is, it became something else. So like you said, it's a true auteur, it's a true creative genius behind the scenes, behind the camera. It's like, well, how do we make this work? And making decisions on the fly. It's also, I mean, it's the first generation with the 70s here, the new Hollywood, of film geeks who were like just born and raised on films. And also for the most part, could go to a film school. Like that was a thing you could graduate from. So you're steeped in this. So like, oh, let's turn this way. Let's go this way. Oh, let's incorporate this. Oh, it's like this one scene in this other movie. Like you listen to early Scorsese conversations. That's how he's describing stuff on set. His anecdotes are like, hey, have you seen this movie? Okay. It's like blah, blah, blah scene. Oh, okay. We'll do it that way.
Right.
So we've got that formula that the lessons are learned from Jaws, how to put this out there. I find that really kind of interesting. You get Rocky in 76, that becomes its own blockbuster, that becomes its own thing. But again, original story, smaller budget. connected with the culture as an underdog story. I like that one also because it's interesting that like the hero doesn't win.
Oh, it's well, part of it is well, what's interesting about almost all the movies we're going to talk about is they're great. Like masterpiece level a lot of times. Yeah, he doesn't win. It's about it's about working class Italians, which is what most of the 70s are about outside of the movies we're talking about.
That's a good point.
Well, it's true. They're either
there's a lot of that in there. I mean, Scorsese, I was just referencing. That's
they're either made by working class Italians, acted by working class Italians, or about working class Italians, or all three.
right.
And that's basically what you're dealing with through. That's really what the 70s means when you talk about New Hollywood. I mean, let's be honest. Like, there's some other stuff out there, but this is what we mean. I am kind of joking, but
I mean, there's clearly a track that is that in the 70s.
There's an interesting. I mean, this is a totally other line of thought. There's an interesting bit to the racial politics and post civil rights stuff involved in that, both in good and bad ways. But like, that's something that's not going to hold for obvious reasons.
Right.
So Jaws is sort of your first out the gate. It's honestly one of my favorite movies. It's kind of perfect, right? That's part of what's going on, for me at least, is that you watch this and it's so satisfying.
Yeah.
And, it is a perfect summer movie. And just to creep you out just a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, but, only a couple kids get eaten. It's really not that bad.
Right.
But then what about Star Wars?
20th Century Fox and George Lucas bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Stop that ship! Blast them!
Chewie, get us out of here! Oh my, I'd forgotten how much I hate space travel.
Here they come.
They're coming in too fast!
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance.
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe.
Come with you to Alderaan. There's nothing for me here now. I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
Well, I mean, I think you can just say the name now. Everybody gets it, right? Star Wars.
Right.
It's pretty close to Jaws, like we were saying. So Star Wars comes out. It's not supposed to be that thing that it becomes. But it's interesting to me, the level, like, because we watched, like, again, shout out to our last summer, we did Summer 60s series, watching like a Barbarella or some of the Corman stuff or some of like the pretty shitty, sci-fi effects things. Like, well, what if we did this, but like with good models and decent effects? Like, it wasn't a genre that was given that kind of love or craft or attention.
Well, I mean, I think
maybe Barbarella. I'll give that one because I like that movie a lot.
Well, and that actually looks great.
Yeah.
But you have 2001 and you have Planet of the Apes, which,
right.
and then you have a whole series of, you have, Logan's Run and you have a lot of sci-fi movies. I don't know what they're, I mean, I don't think, let's say something like Logan's Run or Soylent Green are meant to be low budgeters.
How do you mean?
I mean, in the sense that like they're not throwaway sci-fi movies. They're, that's Charlton Heston, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So part of it is I think, I think part of it is that maybe the 70s as a whole is a period where, starting with those two in the late 60s, sci-fi sort of comes back in a big way because it, from its 50s heyday, and is like, treated differently, right? Like these are big movies and oftentimes high concept about like all of us being worried that the world is going to end in some way or another. Usually,
ooh, yeah. I feel like the high concept thing maybe also like a blockbuster hallmark as well. Eventually,
well, except I mean, part of it is that the hallmark now is like the shadow of a high concept, and but like part of it is like 2001 is about something. You can't tell what it's about unless you watch it a bunch of times and do lots of film study, but it is about something.
Right.
And So is Planet of the Apes, as goofy as it might be, which did spawn its own franchise.
And toys, I believe.
And oh yeah, lots of toys. And then, all of your sort of environmental crisis movies, which is a genre we touched on when we looked at No Blade of Grass.
Right.
That as well. So I'm just trying to think about, like, what is the sci-fi environment that Star Wars is coming out in? Part of the thing about what Star Wars is doing is it's pulling on nostalgia, which is going to be something that's very important in sort of blockbusters and marketing today. I mean, part of it is like we're talking about Jaws as prototypical. In reality, in a certain sense, Jaws is very important. If you think of like Star Wars and Superman, which we will talk about eventually, and Jaws as a trinity, if anything, those other two, other than Jaws, actually somewhat paved the way for the model, right? A little bit more.
Yes. Yeah.
In terms of sort of concept, because like Star Wars is actually not, I wouldn't necessarily call Star Wars high concept. It's Kurosawa. I mean, this is the most, yeah, we know.
Right.
It's Kurosawa and, Buck Rogers.
Right.
But with higher budget, somewhat better acting, and, also perfectly made.
The visuals. Right.
The visual, and incredible story construction and everything. I mean, it's a great movie, but
yeah. So I think the shift, it's like, I'm not a huge like Star Wars buff for that, terribly knowledgeable about it. Like I've gone through the series, like I've seen them, got it done, whatever. One of my closest friends though from film school is like, knows the universe backwards and forwards, reads the novel, like everything. And something, so this is his point. Shout out Justin, was so like science fiction in film in the mid 70s ish, like you said, you've got the Soylent Green, I think Silent Running, one of his favorites, Westworld. That's early 70s. Logan's Run. What's that first goofy John Carpenter one? Dark Star. It's more of and even going back to 2001, even those are all kind of more based on. Even go back to THX 1138, George Lucas's debut. It's more of a science fiction via like paranoia. About like dystopian ideas of science fiction, whereas Star Wars doesn't play in that same sandbox. It's more like you said, like the Buck Rogers, the adventure, like let's have some fun. Like it's not set on this planet, which also probably helps too. So I think that was different. I mean, even with the trailer of Star Wars, you can hear like it's clearly set up as like, this is a space opera, a space adventure.
Our blockbusters, is this another thing? Our blockbusters ultimately escapism, and these movies, in a sense, are not.
Worth keeping track of, I think. You mean like the science fiction stuff of the mid 70s?
Yeah, the science fiction of the 70s does not make you feel good.
Right.
Star Wars makes you feel good. It is escapist.
You're right.
There's themes and there's stuff and there's deeper stuff going on, and I'm not going to say there isn't. But Jaws and Star Wars and Superman are all big escapist cinema for the widest audience.
Well, to quote one of my favorites, see our Captain America Winter Soldier Marvel episode. I'm going to go with Scorsese in this one, and they're amusement park rides.
I mean,
there is that element to it. It's the escapist thrill of an amusement park ride.
I mean, I would say that the element of the amusement park ride is stuff that shows up probably in some of his favorite movies, such as like Thief of Baghdad. I'm poking at Scorsese for certain generational blindness, but that's okay.
Well, he's also saying like he likes an amusement park ride as well. He's not saying like, oh, you should never see these because they're not, pure cinema. Anyway, we already debated that on that episode. So but
it's going to come back. But I think it's going to be interesting as we start to get into thematics of this stuff.
Right. Well, then also along with Star Wars, that wasn't the only blockbuster you get that year. You get Smokey and the Bandit right behind it. Burt Reynolds. There's some escapist fun for you there. But also, so you have the sci-fi of Star Wars. You also have the sci-fi of Close Encounters that year, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Spielberg again. And also, speaking of working class Italians, you get Saturday Night Fever coming in at almost $100 million in 1977.
Wow, can you imagine a movie like Saturday Night Fever, especially if you think that Saturday Night Fever is the cut version you watched on TV as a kid, and then you watch the actual movie.
Oof, yeah, I was one of those.
It is wow. It is not about dancing, kids. It's not about dancing. It's about rape culture. That's actually what it's about.
It is, but also it's 77, and it's a movie about Saturday Night Fever, head to the disco.
But like, kind of like it uses that scene, which is even dying at that point, right? It uses.
Not really.
I think at that point it wasn't actually doing as well, and then it revives. I mean, I think Saturday Night Fever helped to revive it. I could be wrong.
I don't know the history of disco, but like I was watching a 1978-79 movie where Jeff Goldblum, I talked about it on one of our Workers on Film episodes, was running a disco.
Right. But what's interesting about it is that like it's about working class. It's working class life. Your small horizons, cruelty, all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's actually like actually a painful, gritty New York movie.
Oh yeah, it's so dirty.
It's incredibly dirty, and so this is a blockbuster, only in the 70s.
Right. That's kind of interesting because I just Googled that because when my first thought with disco was Studio 54. That was 77.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much that was reported at the time or people knew of that as a cultural thing, but yeah, that's interesting. I didn't mean to derail it with disco. I just meant like that in the same year you have Star Wars as a blockbuster, you also have Smokey and the Bandit and Saturday Night Fever as blockbusters, like legit, like huge blockbusters. So it's not a homogenized one thing yet. It's not just the sci-fi. It's not just the action, although Smokey and the Bandit is action, I guess, but it's also comedy. Like comedy's mixed in there, and that's not usually what you think of when you think of blockbusters.
So like part of what's interesting about this, we're talking about the evolution of the blockbuster, right? So in a sense, Saturday Night Fever is a new Hollywood movie, right? And can be that successful because that's what's big.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what it is. Like it's a new Hollywood movie in a lot of ways. Smokey and the Bandits is like your hillbilly exploitation thing.
I've always heard of it as Hicksploitation.
Or you could call it Hicksploitation.
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating phenomenon that I would love to explore on this very podcast someday.
Yeah, we'll get there.
And part of it is, but that's a very 70s thing, right? Like that's when that happens.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And then Star Wars just won't go the fuck away.
No.
So that's what I mean. It's like these are like evolutionary ends. Like those are big because at that time, I don't know, like that was popular in that time.
Well, I wanted to mention that one specifically too, because culturally, when we think about it, it's 77. You got Star Wars, you got Close Encounters, because it's it's a Spielberg movie, so you got to say Close Encounters. Smokey and the Bandit did better at the box office.
Yeah.
Which again, this is one of these things where I was just like, oh my god, this is like rewriting for me, like what kind of cultural impact you have, or a film can have. Where I was like, to me, I was like, oh no, it's those two movies, and Saturday Night Fever maybe, but Smokey and the Bandit's up there.
I mean, if you had Burt Reynolds' smile, could you fight back?
No, it's impossible. Not unless you have a lightsaber, apparently. So, well, all that to preface the one that, for some reason, like we said at the top of the show, you've got Jaws, you got Star Wars. Those are like the 70s movies that invented the blockbuster. And as you pointed out, Isaac, Superman outgrossed Jaws.
Yes,
for the decade. Like it was behind Star Wars. And granted, Superman is not some obscure movie. We're not singing the praises of like a obscure Bill Gunn film or something. Superman is very well known and it is hugely famous and it has its own complete like Richard Donner fanboy subculture, probably some fangirls too, sorry, out there, but like it isn't mentioned in the same breath. If anything, you skip Jaws, it should be Star Wars and Superman are the ones you talk about.
Yep.
Because of the wisdom and compassion of Jor-El, because he knew the human race had the capacity for goodness, he sent us his only son. His name is Kal-El. He will call himself Clark Kent. But the world will know him as Superman. This year, Superman brings you the gift of flight. Superman, the movie.
Yep. If you're gonna have to choose, that would be it. And
just based on pure box office, like we said.
I think honestly, I probably got this from like the Disc extra features. This thought of like, wait a second, this should be in the genealogy. They probably mention it somewhere, which is admittedly
doesn't. It's not wrong.
It's not wrong, but they're not wrong. Like they're totally right about that. And part of it is, it's a huge movie. It's based off of special effects, right? Like in a sense. I mean, I actually think that its actual superpower is, the fact that you have, quote, realistic, certainly very advanced flying special effects for the day, right?
Yeah.
That really get people. And then I think also, the other superpower that it has is Christopher Reeve. who is utterly iconic for the role, and really sells this. And basically, you never actually succeed. The part of the reason that it in a sense kills Superman because they've never escaped that.
Right.
There's been lots and lots of Superman, especially, and some successful ones on TV, but they're always compared, and it never quite works. And it's
That's a
true.
good point. Even if it's not like a conscious thing, like you do, I mean, probably it was a conscious thing, but anytime there's a write-up of a new one, like the comparison is always to Christopher Reeve in this one.
See, part of the thing is that if you look at Batman, who's like the obvious comparison, who now is more successful in a lot of ways, there's some very good Batman, but there's none who are so good that they're definitive.
Yeah, there's not a Christopher Reeve Batman.
So this is a very culturally significant. It's based off of iconic character.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the only one of these that's based off of a pre-existing IP. It's the prototype. It is the first modern superhero movie, right?
For sure, yeah.
And that is the dominant genre and has been for nearly 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're all children of this movie. We should just jump into it. I mean, do we want to talk about the production first and then sort of like talk about the movie itself?
I wanted to mention the production offhand first, I think, just because there was a couple of notes I had where I was like, wait, what? So I was coming to this film. I have seen the Richard Pryor one a bunch as a kid because I was into Mel Brooks and Richard Pryor comedies thanks to my dad. So like I just had watched, what is that 3, I think?
Mm-hmm.
3 a bunch as a kid because it was one thing I got from the library on VHS a lot. I rewatched this one going like, I'm pretty sure I watched this, but I don't remember too much. And I remembered like 4 scenes basically. So I hadn't watched this since probably like a TBS version when we first got cable in the early 90s. So I was kind of watching it for the first time going like, wait a minute. Robert Benton and David, like the Bonnie and Clyde screenwriters? Wait, Mario Puzo, like the Godfather guy? And then cinematographer pops up and like the guy that shot 2001, A Space Odyssey?
Yes.
John Williams doing the music. Wait, John... obviously, I knew the John Williams one, but then I'm even down to like Stuart Baird as the editor and stuff. I was like, wait, how Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman are billed before the name Superman comes on screen, and then I think it's like Ned Beatty, like Christopher Reeve isn't even like the top star, like he's Superman for fuck's sake, and he's like the 4th or 5th build. It was so weird. Just like the credit sequence had my film geek head just spinning, going like, I don't understand the world this movie was made in.
Well, it's a world in which they're creating it, right? And part of it is they're relying on those stars to underpin this movie, both to get people in the seats to go like, this is credible. They're trying to make it, it's kind of a prestige picture, right? With those people in it.
Yeah.
And it's a prestige picture. It's,
well, again, also, like we said, just for some context, like this is Marlon Brando immediately after Godfather 1 and 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is Gene Hackman after Poseidon Adventure, The Conversation, French Connection 2. What's the other the bridge one? Bridge Too Far. Like,
see, part of it is they're to get butts in seats, and I also think they both do a great job in the movie.
Oh, they're fantastic. Gene Hackman is amazing.
Yeah, and part of it is this for a teenage me. I'm not saying actual teenage me, but for teenage me, the relative goofiness of this would like be off-putting. But
I want to talk about that when we get into like the movie itself,
yeah,
because like that was something I was not expecting.
But actually watching Gene Hackman, oh my God, I mean he's so good. All right, we'll get into that. But Christopher Reeve isn't going to be billing, but when you get in the seats, you need him to work. He has to work.
Oh, I just meant like from our eyes now, like watching it again back in 1978. I get it, but from nowadays, like we just said, he is the bar for this character, and to see him like the 4th or 5th build, I was just like, wait, what?
I should also mention when we're talking about this movie that I'm a big Superman fan, and I love Superman for a lot of the reasons that a lot of times people say he's not cool. And so I will not be unbiased in my views of this film and it's in its place. So yeah, so it's a prestige picture. There's Mario Puzo, though frankly, I don't know how much of his script is actually left by the time they're done with it.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It was like all the names, I was like, this is not what I was expecting.
Yeah, no, they really go for it. I mean, I think Tom Mankiewicz actually is probably responsible for a lot more of this, because basically here's part of the problem. This is an incredibly troubled production consisting of a war between its director, Richard Donner, and the Salkind Salkins, who are the producers, who made another one of my favorite, two movies, The Three and Four Musketeers. And just to get a sense of them, if you don't know about this, which a lot of you probably do, that production causes the creation of the Salkin clause, because they take Three Musketeers and turn it into two and don't pay the actors for the second one. And so this is enough of a big deal for obvious reasons. Basically, they're scuzzballs, okay?
Right.
I'm going to decide in this fight. I think they're scuzzballs. I kind of believe Richard Donner. I realize there's people who know a lot more about this than me. I haven't dug, there's probably books about this.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I kind of believe Richard Donner when he's saying he literally didn't know the budget of the film. And while he's making it, so he keeps being told that he's over budget, they keep penny pinching on him, but he doesn't even know. How do you make a movie like that? I have no idea.
Working with, right.
They, and there's a New York Times article from like right before Superman 2 comes out, where I think it's Ilya Salkind, who's the son. I mean, this is basically three generations, and two of them are involved in this. Is confirming that basically because he won't confirm what the budget is. He goes anywhere from 109 million for both Superman 1 and 2 to 100 and to like 140, which is like a big difference.
That's wild for also the late 70s budget wise.
It's completely out of control.
Yeah.
I have no idea what shenanigans are really going on there. There were many lawsuits involved in this. It's not great. They do run the franchise into the ground, obviously, take it from its prestige stuff. They fire Richard Donner. It's very controversial. They put Richard Lester on. Richard Lester had done their two previous Three Musketeer movies on 2, but of course it's complicated and there's multiple different cuts of 2 as well because Donner had already done a lot of the movie already. I mean, I think it was pretty close to being done, not totally. So it's very troubled. And I think you were saying this. Basically, what you're dealing with is this is like a Cannon Group or Corman model, except it's like Corman, except it's way scuzzier and crueler to the directors and actually detrimental to the quality of the film.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Like part of it is you get this feeling of these guys are like scamsters enough that they both want the prestige and the scale, but they also like there's a self-destructive element to it.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like you're going to undermine everything that you got out of this and then take a lot of credit for what's good, which I just don't really believe, but I don't know.
Well, when you're already that scuzzy to begin with, like kind of going for the credits, yeah, you're just like, I'm siding with Donner on this one. This guy seems like he's got a bit more of a true stake in the truth of what's going on here.
Right. Well, basically part of it is they are like, Canon and all that before, except they're operating at a much larger scale, right? These are massive movies. They're doing it with Warner. They before the release of the movie, they hold the print hostage. I think it's the print maybe it's the negative hostage with Warner. They want another 15 million before they'll actually release it. I mean, it's just
a hostage situation over the film print. A movie in itself, right there.
I mean, I just watched Mikey and Nikki where something similar happened, except that it's Elaine May doing it, hiding it from the studio so they won't destroy her movie, which is like beautiful and wonderful and we're on your side. And these guys are just like total scuzzball. So the fact that it's as good as it is really impressive in itself.
Right.
But it's also, as troubled as modern blockbusters are, this is like a family affair, right? And part of what's interesting about it to me is like you could never imagine a big corporate blockbuster with an IP of this scale and having it like be this, it's not corporatized, right? It's like a family business running this. And I think that's kind of interesting to me.
Oh, you mean from like the Salkins point of view?
Yeah, from the Salkins point of view, it's, this is not like, Amazon or Disney / Marvel / whatever, right? Like it's that you could take a character as potentially big as Superman, who by the early 80s had through the life over the last 40 years, produced, like made $1 billion for the various owners of the rights, which $1 billion from the 1940s onward is a lot of money.
Crazy. Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely exponential. What is that? That could be what, $7-10 billion? I don't know. It's crazy. And of course, the creators, Siegel and Schuster, didn't see a goddamn penny of it. right?
Mhm.
Through most of that time. They sold off their, I mean, part of the whole history of comic book writers, and especially the first generation, but all through, and getting what they deserve for what they create is a whole other story. They eventually sue, and I think Warner, or one of the companies involved in this, basically gives them a stipend for the rest of their life. But after this movie comes out, I mean, they're looking, this is like one of the biggest movies of the decade.
Yeah.
And they're looking, and we're completely cut out. We created this character, wrote it for years, and get nothing out of this. So they eventually they get a very little comparatively, but like plenty for them to retire on eventually. But it takes a lot. It basically takes them shaming the companies into doing this, which, doesn't always work. So part of it is truth, justice, and the American way. I love Superman actually for the ideals. I'm a socialist, and at a certain level, and you can tear this apart from a leftist perspective, what he stands for, caring for people at a very fundamental level. I think there is a point where like Lois Lane literally says, Superman cares about everybody, right? And it's like, I think that's beautiful sentiment that actually needs to be lived up to, because I'm a softie.
Well, right, because he's pointing out as like a romantic thing, where he's like, "Oh, I think he likes you." She's like, "Yeah, he likes everybody."
Yeah, let's get into the movie, because he does like everybody, but he likes Lois Lane more.
Yes, but he makes the choice to not rush off to save her first,
because he promised, and because he can't lie, and because either way millions of people die. But one of them is going to hit a city, and the other one is going to cause an earthquake that he might be able to stop, because he's a real hero. And it's none of this like I'm selfish bullshit. I'm looking at you, Zack Snyder, Superman. I just, yeah, it's the real deal. Sorry, I'm done. This may be a different side of me on this podcast. I don't normally let out this level of geek. I'm usually a movie geek, not a comic book geek on here. But
I mean, this perfectly overlaps. So
it does perfectly overlap.
As a comic book geek, though, I have a couple of questions for you about this movie, because this is like you're what my go-to for, like, if I see a film like this or a property like this that I have some questions on. So I mentioned I was a little flabbergasted by the screenwriting credits on this. Is this an adaptation of a storyline from the comics?
No.
Okay.
No, and in fact, part of what's interesting, I mean, obviously it's drawn from the comics as they were at that time.
Well, like, you got Metropolis, you got Lex Luthor, you got Lois Lane, obviously you have Superman, you got Smallville, you got Krypton.
You got all the elements. Here's one thing I should be clear about me as a fan. I'm not a deep enough fan, because I have not read. So Marvel and DC have ongoing continuities, right? Marvel always approaches it by basically having a rolling continuity in which everything has happened, but we're going to wink about it because it's not really sustainable to do this over 50 or 60 years. DC approaches this by rebooting their entire continuity and then fucking it up again as they slowly integrate the parts of the old continuity in, because fans wanted it that way, and everybody gets confused. The first time that they do this is in 1985, Crisis on Infinite Earths, which reboots their continuity, changes a lot of things. The post-crisis Superman is the one that I know best. The pre-crisis one, which this is based on because it's 7 years earlier, I don't know as well. As a character, as a background, as a power set.
Okay.
That all being said, it's not based off of a particular story. It's based off of, his
world is there that they're operating, but it wasn't like, oh, that was Lex Luthor's evil plan and issue, whatever.
I mean, you can tell this, the version of Lex Luthor that you're operating with. So post-crisis, if you're used to Lex Luthor as a big corporate billionaire who is sometimes in jail, not always in jail, that's a post-crisis thing where he becomes that. Whereas pre-crisis, he's more of a mad scientist, which is where he is in this. Later on down the line, he becomes a sort of a mad scientist again more, because superhero comics are endlessly repetitive.
That's interesting. I really didn't think about him as a mad scientist in this one more, but yeah, I guess that could work for this one.
I mean, they don't really call him that. He's a criminal mastermind.
Yeah, like criminal genius kind of thing. I had some strong, again, I am not the comic book geek or even barely a fan. I've read some great stuff that you've recommended, but I'm not going through it the way you have. It gave me some film universe Joker vibes, like the elaborate plots and the schemes and the decision that he puts Superman in, like this rocket or that rocket, like some of that stuff. I was like, oh, that's pretty good classic villain, but also some forethought to like the scheming and the plan. And also it's one of those, like we've mentioned with heist movies, previous episodes, the way that Lex Luthor has his finale, like the last 35, 40 minutes, depending on which cut you watch of this, his plan going, he doesn't tell you specifically the whole plan, some parts of it. So as it's playing out, you're like, that's doing that thing. I mean, he does do the whole villain thing where he walks Superman around his lair and tells him blah, 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 and then I'm going to do this and this. But it's only the parts he wants to let Superman in on to a certain extent. But I liked his performance, Gene Hackman's performance as Lex Luthor in this one quite a bit. Honestly, I didn't get much out of Marlon Brando in this one.
Sure.
I think it was like later 70s Brando that I'm not that taken by. In my timeline of Marlon Brando personally, I think he kind of peaks with Godfather. Then it's like, Apocalypse Now, he does what he needs to do. Fine. That doesn't draw me in for that particular movie. He's more of like a phantom in that movie that by the time I get to it, I was like, it's not anticlimactic, but it's about what I expected. There's nothing really like jaw dropping to me about that one.
He's about as engaged as he's going to be in this era.
Fine. He's doing what he's doing and it's fine. It's not like he's bad. It's just
he is reading his lines off of like every surface.
Right. Yeah, we're not like Island of Dr. Moreau level Brando just yet, but like it's fine. It's fine. And he's not in it that much, so it's like great. Predominantly as a floating head, whatever. It's fine.
So the other thing about the comic book element of this movie is sort of like for Batman, it would be Batman the Animated Series. Batman the Animated Series is so influential that all the comics and everything that comes after it are playing off of this. This movie, in many ways, defines Superman at a very deep level, even within the comics. A lot of comics are deeply influenced by this, by its style, by Reeves himself, by the portrayal.
That's interesting.
So it's, including there's an era in the 2000s where literally you have an artist who's just trying to make Superman look like Reeves, which is not normally what you do. So this movie, for the character, this is not derivative. This is a definitive take within both popular culture, but even within geek culture itself.
I hadn't really thought about that. So like it's a conversation between the creators in the film world and the comic book world that's going, oh yeah, that is interesting.
And oftentimes nowadays, since comic book movies are really big, you see this with the X-Men movies in the early 2000s in very ham-fisted, weak ways. But, there's intentional, like, synchronizing between them as IP factories, right?
Mm-hmm.
That may be what's going on to a certain degree, but you don't have something where literally 30 years or more after the movie comes out, you have people writers still hopping on this. And there's a reason. That's because it's, it is what it is. Did you have another comic book question?
No, that was it for comic books.
Okay.
I was just curious because it's one of those, like, it's known as a comic book property. Did this come from, like Batman? Or like, oh, this is actually a rework of the Killing Joke or whatever. So that was it for the comic books. There were two things that came up in this movie that I thought were apropos for our discussion today about it. One of them is the cinematography. Seeing that credit at the beginning of the movie for Jeffrey Unsworth, knowing that he shot 2001: A Space Odyssey. The opening scenes of this movie, I was getting real strong Barbarella set design from. But one of the differences I thought in this one that was interesting was the shots were being held for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Like when they're on, give me the name of the planet now it starts on. Krypton, thank you. When they're on Krypton, like it's a long, like slow moving camera in over obviously models and all that. But I was like, it gives it a stronger sense of place and seriousness. Cause also John Williams' score obviously helps out with setting the scenes and the tone as well. So I thought that was interesting to kind of like trying to up the game from what generally science fiction at the time was. Like it was holding the shots. And I had like 2001 in my head. So I was like, oh, it's a little closer to 2001 where like, we're not cutting because we only have so much of a set built or so much of a model built. We're not trying to hide or Corman, like the Corman stuff. Again, I love Corman and all that, but it lets you know, like we built this whole huge model and we're going to do a slow zoom in down the crevice, then in through, this opening to go into the court scene where they're sentencing these three people and all that. So the cinematography to it, I thought was really interesting, especially in some of the special effects scenes where like it holds a shot for a much longer period of time. One, kind of just showing off that we can do these special effect shots a little differently now than we did before. But it didn't seem like it was cutting at all then to cover gaps in the production or the lack of set design or something. I don't know. It felt like like a larger world that way.
That is the point. And I think that just to point out, that is combined with, I think this might be my favorite John Williams score. And like Reeves's performance, it's something that in some ways Superman can never live down. I mean, it's certainly you can say similar things about like Danny Elfman's Batman, but that still doesn't hold. That still isn't like, it's great, but people don't remember it quite in the same way as this. And this particular scene, the particular horns,
Yeah.
in that scene project the grandeur that you're supposed to be seeing on the screen, right?
Right.
You are seeing a high civilization. They're going all in, right? What's interesting about this movie tonally is it's so goofy and yet serious at the same time.
That was my second point I wanted to bring up. Yeah.
It really is. And I think the music brings that home, because this is I get it. It's a Jesus metaphor. By the way, Superman is not really Jesus. Well, all right, you can do Jesus if you want to. He's really Moses. Come on. Like, it's created by Jews, like almost every other superhero. And it's not an accident. Kal-El, which is his Kryptonian name, is like from not the Old Testament, like from the Jewish Bible. But it's the name of an angel. But nonetheless, that grandeur and the sort of the sense that, of otherworldliness just comes through so well. And I think for the reasons that you're talking about, combined with the music and with a bunch of like well-known high-class British character actors in Marlon Brando.
Oh, for sure. That part, again, like that is the gravitas and that you get when you have Brando in there, rather than just some character actor that you could have cast in that part.
Yeah.
When the Godfather is there on a different planet, like, elucidating about like the laws and what we need to do and how society, like it gives it much more weight.
But there's Trevor Howard being an asshole. I don't think I ever actually noticed it was him until now. I was like, oh, cool.
Right. So yeah, tone. Funny you should mention that, because obviously that's very well connected. But that was the other thing that came up in this movie to me, was the tone. I think it's a byproduct of the era we are currently living in of comic books, or I should say the ones that I am more drawn to, which is not the Marvel universe. It's more the more recent Christopher Nolan work in Batman, or even like you mentioned, Batman the Animated Series a little bit ago. The let's take it seriously, or like Joker just came out, which I'm not just came out, but is a more recent one that I'm not a big fan of, but like that's very serious. They're rated R. I haven't seen the Wolverine rated R, but like I've heard good stuff about that, where it's like, it's serious. This one I thought was really fascinating because and I'm not saying I dislike Superman. I don't know that much about Superman to really have an opinion, to be honest, but it inherently to me was like, seemed kind of goofy and childish. It's like, it's this invincible guy, or an alien that's on the planet, just happens to look just like a human, whatever, all of that stuff. And then the level of seriousness that the movie starts with Brando and the stuff we were just talking about. Then he comes to Earth and he's a child and lifts the truck and he's raised. Luckily, he lands apparently in small town America and gets, good old wholesome white Midwestern American values, so that he's not, growing up with different values, I guess, that would have potentially sent him on a different track with his superpowers. So when it gets to be him as an adult, as Christopher Reeve, and also this speaks to his performance, like some of the more goofy things were immediately undercut by like, yeah, wait, that's weird, right? Or what is going on here? Or not quite like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It wasn't like that. It was more just like acknowledging that this is kind of goofy at times.
Mm-hmm.
And I really loved that tone, because like, and it didn't feel out of place. It as a skeptic going in to watch this, where I was just like, okay, fine, I'm watching this like 70s Superman version, whatever. Having Gene Hackman basically need like, he's giving like laugh breaks with some of the stuff that he's saying, or Christopher Reeve doing the Clark Kent thing. He should not be able to play a 6'4" whatever, like dopey character, because he doesn't like, he's a chiseled, like gorgeous man, but he threw on the glasses and the weird haircut and like the way he's constantly pushing up his glasses, and like he's not doing a dork voice, I guess, or whatever, but like it was so weird that I was like, man, he can really switch between like the comic and he's not doing like suave Superman on like their balcony date where they go flying or anything, but like it's a very different performance, and all that's changed are glasses and a little curl of hair, I guess.
So we were talking about like why this movie is iconic and why it's so influential. Like, I mean, look at the recent. I'm not talking about it on TV or whatever. I mean, there's better attempts at this stuff, but nobody's ever done that. Like, switched that well. Like, nobody's been so immersed in being able to switch so effortlessly in both characters. And you see that date scene. I want to focus a lot on that because that's an amazing scene. And the tonal balance and what they do with Superman there is amazing. Because this is a Superman that probably fucks, and I'll get to that. I'm kind of joking, but I'm not. But there's a scene there where he wants to tell Lois, right?
Yeah.
And you see him switch his body language, right?
Yeah. Oh, he takes the glasses off in her apartment.
Yeah, but his body changes too.
It does.
His posture, everything changes. It's real. He's putting doing this right actually takes some serious acting, and Christopher Reeve was willing to put it in.
Yeah.
And if you take the goofiness seriously, then it works really well. All right, I'm sort of joking about the Superman. What I mean by that is, I think that this Superman is more adult than any Batman version there is. Why? Because he's not an emotional invalid and he can actually flirt. That's not true. Actually, I think the Keaton Batman could flirt a little bit.
But I was gonna say the Keaton Batman is very different because as a kid growing up watching Keaton stuff, as we talked about with Gung Ho, previous episode, and Dream Team and Mr. Mom, I was excited going into that Batman because it was this comedian playing Batman that I thought was hilarious.
Right.
And so I think culturally it was a little different seeing Keaton like, as long as he was competently smooth or could say a one line to a female character, because this is a heterosexual Batman, that was enough. This one's different. The Reeve Superman is very very different because I was watching it pretty much for the first time at this round, but like at the time that Chris Reeve did this role, like he wasn't known.
Right.
This is a blank slate actor coming in, Juilliard trained, et cetera, like his whole background. I see what you're saying there with the Batman, but like this was just very different to me.
But I think part of it is, so he plays Superman as somebody with all the compassion and everything that you associate with the character rolls off of him, right? But also confidence in himself. So his interactions so the balcony scene there with Lois, part of it is they're really flirting and like kind of like inappropriately for a kid's movie almost.
Yeah.
Superman looks at her underwear. I mean, she invites it and he does.
Well, she's talking about size and things too. Like it's that level that it would go over the head of a kid. Except maybe the underwear line.
But adults are like laughing at it, and he plays that. This is the tonal brilliance of his performances. He is still both aw shucks, I never lie, and at the same time clearly like playing into lots of sexual innuendo and like really flirting, and is hot, right? Yeah. Like he's not just a good looking guy, he's acting attractive in that scene, and at the same time that he's balancing the wholesomeness. To me, that's crazy.
It's just also a scene of like wild edging because after he's like doing his seduction thing and he's flying her around, no one else could do this on a first date with her. Zero.
Right.
And then when it's all done, he's like, all right, see ya. And just like flies off. And you can see like she is swooning. Like she says her sentences are all like jumbled when she's talking to Clark Kent. Like a moment later, she could not get her head on straight after that experience.
Yeah. I mean, Miss Teschmacher, like Lex Luthor's sort of like henchwoman. This is kind of the same way. Like she's really struggling when he's around.
Oh, that's true. I mean, that's just raw, lust for a chiseled alien god at that point. But like with Margot Kidder, like her, like she's actually like connecting.
She's connecting, and she does. Part of it is I think the actors have great chemistry.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah.
I mean, so part of it is like there's very few superhero movies. There's a few, I think maybe the Raimi Spider-Man movies, that even attempt to go at that level, right? So at a certain level, it's like a goofy kids movie, but the adults sometimes, I mean, the tonal control is such that the sort of the goofy or over the topness is like totally intentional, and when they act like adults, they actually act more like adults. I think also, I mean, just something to note, like the build up. I've seen like complaints about the first part of the movie, which I think is beautiful and sort of picturesque, but it's like the iconic origin. And then when you finally, you're like over an hour into this and you get to see Superman actually do something.
Mm-hmm.
The helicopter save scene is amazing because you've been waiting for this and you knew it was coming, and it's deeply satisfying just to see him save people. And the crowd reactions are exactly what you need. So just the construction of all that is just, it blows my mind.
That was interesting. Because to me, structurally, like from a screenplay standpoint, I was looking at, how this is structured. Because it's clearly like, I think this one clearly to me has like a pretty clear cut 3-act structure. Because like you have the origin story, which nowadays they would just like, let's just do a whole movie on that. I'm like, okay, well, you don't really need to, but whatever. People are aware who Superman is. But yeah, that once you get to the helicopter scene, it was like, oh, we finally get to see Superman doing some Superman shit. And so I hit the display to see how far into the movie we were. I was like, damn, they really built this up. So then I was like, oh, is this gonna be like a Jaws thing? Like the way that the lesson that was learned post Jaws was like little by little, build up to that climax. No, then this is just like a montage of it basically being like friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, just like stopping a burglar, getting a cat out of a tree. Like it doesn't slowly dole out the effects. It was like that scene wows you, and then it's just like, okay, here's a whole bunch more too. Not to diminish those, but it was just like I was expecting a bit more of like, okay, we won't see much more many more effects or Superman being Superman for a little bit. But then he's like, hey, I saved her. There's other stuff I could be doing.
I can save everybody.
Right.
That's actually what I'll do. Well, because I failed to save my adopted father. So
well, yeah, he's working through some issues. That's for sure.
He's working through various issues. I mean, he's working through a lot of issues in this movie. I mean, here's the thing. So instead of going with the Snyder like weird pseudo libertarian like version of the character, where it's like he's so alienated to the point at which does he save people? I guess he will, but we'll never actually motivate that in the film. We'll just assume because that's what Superman does. In this, he's definitely alienated, right? Like he is as a kid. His powers make him separate. They talk about that repeatedly, but like he can handle it. Like it's hard. There's stuff that messes with him. Like he can be a bit of a mess, but like he can handle it.
Right.
He's an adult. You deal.
Well, I should say, as we're doing through this blockbuster thing here, I may have to. I've watched 0 Superman movies since Superman 3 as a kid. So I may have to jump in and check out some of the more modern. Just because we watched this one, like if we're going to be capping it off with more modern stuff, I'll have to watch a more modern Superman movie as we get closer.
Ooh, okay. Well,
separate topic. We'll get there eventually. But I just want to say, like, I know I'm kind of intrigued because having seen this one, I'd be curious to see what a more modern version would be.
Well, I mean, think about Superman Returns, which is like 2006. It's in the same universe as this one, and it's totally homaging the hell out of this.
Well, that might be the one to go with then, I guess. It's Bryan Singer, though, isn't it? I don't know.
That's Bryan Singer, right? Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see when we get there. But
well, part of it is it's actually the curse of Superman because you're still in the shadow of this film, right? And then when you try to do something original, you go in. Yeah. Well, anyway.
Right.
Right. So here's my question. And I took this from other sources, right? Like it's not, this is not me thinking about this. I can't remember everywhere I got this, but this is an interesting movie tonally because I think sometimes people watching, it's an older movie, it's reflecting an earlier time. It's like, no. This is like gritty, movies in the 70s were a hell of a lot more edgy than most movies today, frankly. And
today for sure.
Yeah. And so this is in this landscape. And he's really in that New York. It's not like a goofy New York. It's a real New York. I mean, Metropolis, whatever. So, I mean, to an extent, right? They don't go all the way.
It's no Pawnbreaker New York, but it is, like you said, it's Metropolis. It's not actually New York, but wink, wink, nudge, judge. We know.
Right. But it is, but part of it is that, it knows they know what they're doing because, like, the things that people say about, like, Superman's values being anachronistic today are actually just as true in the 70s.
Oh, values. Yeah. Because like the white Midwestern like youth that he has is like, is this like the 1940s? Like, 'cause that's what it feels like. I mean, you've got obviously, who's his dad? Glenn Ford,
right.
Playing his dad. Like, it feels like a 1940s, 1950s Hollywood. But you're like, oh, wait, it's almost 1980 when he gets to the city.
Yes.
Which is only a couple of years later. I get it, he's more of an adult, but like, I don't think that's supposed to have been set in like the 40s, was it?
It's supposed to be set in the 50s.
50s. Okay, well that is pretty accurate then. But yeah, the city is differently. I mean, I didn't really honestly find the New York that it's in to be that gritty. I mean, it felt more like Ghost.
I wouldn't say gritty, but it's not, it's not like totally a cartoon world. He's supposed to be in our world.
Right. I see what you're saying. Realistic. It's a very realistic what's it called? Metropolis. Yes.
Right. As compared to, alien space god, cheerful alien space god, saving, cats and things. And then Lex Luthor, who doesn't fit into any sort of reality that could be.
No. But he makes it work. Like his whole like underground layer. I was like, I don't know. I was digging that part. Also, like seeing Ned Beatty, again, speaking of actors through the 70s and the roles they played, then seeing Ned Beatty playing like comic relief and really well, pretty fun.
That's what I associate Ned Beatty with because that's the first movie I saw him in.
Oh, see, I'm a network fanatic, so like top 10 American films on my list, network's on there, and so I just picture that Ned Beatty. Or you've got Deliverance, I guess, or whatever. But yeah.
I mean, look, the last time I saw him was once again in Mikey and Nicky, which I watched like a couple weeks ago, and there he's playing an assassin.
I was like, very different in that one too.
Yeah, well, it's like he's really, really talented.
Yeah, it's like they got together some talented folks here. But
I guess what I mean is I'm trying to think of like where this fits into the politics of the period.
I don't know. I was thinking of that watching this too, and I really didn't have too much of my notes other than like it's got the whole truth, justice, the American way sort of thing. It always sounded weird to me to hear like the American way coming from an alien. But they do work in kind of Superman is participating in a life experiment with his hologram talking head dad. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, well, when in Rome, like, here's what we're doing. Like, now I need to see what like love and relationships are like, or we're like Superman as alien anthropologist, like checking it out. But then, like, since you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to alter the course or interact with your experiment. He's not supposed to fly around the world fast and turn back time because that's how that works, I guess. So that there are all those moments that really feel very comic booky that I was just like, oh, okay, we're doing this, fine.
But I love that stuff. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it pulls me out of it, but maybe that's because it does feel pretty grounded,
right,
for the most part.
But that's the thing, is everything's grounded except, I mean, here's the thing: is this his childhood? Yes, technically that could be the 50s. It's also 100%. I mean, the music is doing Copeland through that whole thing. It's the 30s, right?
Oh yeah, it's so like Americana, just
it's pure Americana.
Yeah,
right?
what's the Saturday Evening Post guy? Rockwell, kind of. Yeah, Rockwell and Copeland just mixed together and come to life. Surprised he wasn't going to a sock hop at one point.
I mean, practically.
Yeah.
And like that's the thing. So like he comes out of this like mythic place, goes to the big city, which is very grounded in the real world, but he's not part of the real world. He's the reason why he causes you to like sparks imagination and wonder in people in the movie, is because he's that Clash, right? He doesn't fit in that world. He's bigger than that world, and he's like it's like a cartoon come to life, but like one that can flirt with you.
Right, which again shouldn't work. And also the fact that they don't ground him as a character in Metropolis. You don't see where he lives. You don't see him like eating or anything functional. He's just around as this entity that we know the story of, but nobody else knows.
Right.
So when he needs to be at work, he just appears at work. When he needs to be Superman, he just is Superman.
Yeah, they don't get a lot. I mean, part of it is they get into the sort of inner emotional life of the Clark Kent version, but not the material life. You know what I mean?
Right. That's a good way to say it. Right. Which is interesting that the emotional life of him actually is that effective, because we don't see anything to ground it in other than like the performance of Reeve.
Well, and Margot Kidder and whoever plays Perry White, it's escaping me right now, because that's who he's playing off of, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they allow him, and then the fact that Reeves is really good, like we said, is like the reason this works is because he sells it.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's actually kind of more remarkable that I'm thinking about it now that he sells it as effectively as he does when there's like so little to know about him.
Right.
So like, does he fly back? Does he just like live at the what's this palace up in Antarctica made of all the crystals, or up in the Arctic or whatever?
The Fortress of Solitude.
Fortress of Solitude. Is that where he goes every night?
I mean,
or does he have an apartment in Metropolis? Or like, you don't see the functionality of him being a member of the society.
Right.
But it still works.
I mean, part of the thing is like this version of him, this stuff gets very weird. I mean, he basically, up until like his teens, he lives on a farm in the Midwest. Then he lives in the Fortress of Solitude for 12 years, learning with Space Dad.
Oh yeah, that's true. In Time Path, yeah.
It's a weird choice. And then he's in some ways, and that makes him more half alien than anything else, right?
Right.
He's socialized in both completely. This is a politics of cinema movie where I really want to talk about the politics. We could talk about the politics of superheroes, as Ubermensch, and Superman would be like the ultimate version of that, or the propagandistic element of the American way, or whatever. I just don't find that very interesting at this point, because like, no kidding.
Right. Yeah, I think this is one of those that like some of that has already been covered
to death
as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I think it's interesting and comparable a little bit with Star Wars in this era, where there have been superhero movies. This isn't like the first superhero movie. The way Star Wars wasn't the first, science fiction space film. The way Jaws wasn't the first like creature feature film. But these three films, capping off the 70s with Superman, those three together, I don't know, these three should all just be mentioned together when you're talking about blockbusters in the 70s and the birth of this thing. And I think it's interesting that they're all coming from genres that were already in existence, but I think it's also the way that the medium of film had evolved to allow all three of those different films to, well, especially Superman, like be better. Like you can tell when like, oh, that's a model, but it's not the way that like, oh, that's a model in a Godzilla film.
Right.
Like it's shot more effectively to be like, if I was a kid, like I'm watching it with my eyes, I'm going like, okay, that's clearly a model. Okay, well, how are they flying there? How are they like? How is this working? But as a kid, that would be seamless.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you weren't going to get that if you made that movie in the early 60s or in early iterations of Superman when it was like serialized or whatever. It was finally able to be done then. And to be honest, I haven't seen it, but I'm just going to go make a judgment call. It probably, to me, it's going to feel better than like a current Superman where it's all just like CGI, green screen, and all of that. Like, I don't know. I kind of like feeling or seeing like the fingerprints of how it's made.
Yeah.
Not in a cheap way, but just like, like that Lois's outfit when they go flying was chosen because you need to have some movement. That's why he's got a cape on, and it's not just like a dopey looking like person in tights just like moving with a green screen behind him or whatever. Like you need to have a certain costume design on him and also on Lois that you can see like the flapping of like a flowy dress, like, in the breeze. That's going to add something to it.
I hadn't even thought about it, but that's absolutely true.
This one, Superman capping off the 70s, is really kind of interesting because I think as effective financially as Superman was at the box office, Star Wars, and Jaws, there's other things that there's lessons that are learned there that continue through, and because you get sequels to Jaws, you get sequels to Star Wars, you get sequels to Superman. 1 year earlier in 76, Rocky, you get sequels to Rocky. You don't. When we get to the 80s, and then throughout the rest of this series, I want to keep track of sequels and franchises and how those come up. Because as I had mentioned to you, as we're going year by year, 78, you got Superman top of the box office. And then in 79, near the top of the box office is like Kramer versus Kramer. Well, that's interesting because it's not a movie that you get from Hollywood these days. An adult drama that actually connects and then, is financially wildly successful as well.
Right.
So and also you can't sequelize that. There was no like, oh, do we do Kramer versus Kramer, the TV show, or is it a sitcom, or it's just not a thing. It's just successful. Like, oh, wow, man, good job on that. What are we doing next? Like Richard Donner got Superman because he did The Omen in 76, and that was a huge hit. You didn't get The Omen until you had The Exorcist come out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new kind of horror film. So because that's successful, that opened the door to Superman. So you don't get Superman unless you have The Exorcist in a weird way.
Mm.
So it's interesting to see how these are connected. And since we're doing this sequentially, I kind of want to see how those threads go. Also in 78, you've got Halloween. John Carpenter's film comes out. It makes like 40 some million at the box office. So it's not top of the list, but based on how much it made and the impact it has, obviously that's a huge impact.
And starts the slasher boom.
And also spawns, a series, a universe of Halloween movies that continue to this day.
Right. I mean, part of it is if you're talking about the genre, the actual specific genre that pioneers shared universes and long continuities, and then ignoring long continuities, is horror movies.
Right. Well, okay, then 79, you also have Amityville Horror, which technically I think is that that's an AIP one or Crown? I think it's an AIP property. But anyway, like Amityville comes out the year after Halloween, and then you also the same exact year you have Alien, horror in space. Now we can get into like high concept ideas, things like that. The capping off the decade was interesting too because you do get some sequelization. You get Rocky in 79. Makes not as much as the first one, but still it's a huge hit. And you also have this interesting trend, which is definitely going to continue. You cap off 79 with Star Trek, the motion picture. I don't think you're going to get that in theaters, probably without Star Wars being wildly successful. Like, oh, there's a market for a big budget version of this thing that's already a cultural phenomenon, Star Trek.
And absolutely. And, actually the Star Trek movies through the 80s are very successful. I mean, we haven't really talked about them in our blockbusters, but they actually are, right? Like
we didn't start yet. We're going to get to them in the 80s potentially. It starts in 79 as a film. Yeah. So we'll get into that with the 80s.
Have you ever seen that movie?
Nope.
It is, they're really going for 2001. that's what's funny about it is it's such a Star Trek thing because yeah, sure you're here because of Star Wars, but you're definitely not going to do Star Wars. You're going to try to do 2001 and just make it really, really slow. And I love Star Trek. I mean, it's generally I think that's the consensus on that one. It's pretty funny.
That one might be coming out of a different milieu as well. If it's like, you know, it's the TV universe that's clearly created and flourishing. Yeah, that's not going to end up being your action packed science fiction, but you're going to the big screen for the seeing the hits too. Like you want to see those characters and you want to see the deck of the Enterprise. You want to see it, you know, warp speed lights, whatever they do. You want to see there's certain beats you're going to have to hit with a Star Trek movie that, you know, aren't pre-existing when you're doing a Star Wars movie. Anyway, that is our introduction to our blockbuster series. A little bit of setting the groundwork, what we're tracking, what we're going to be looking at as we plug along through, but focusing a little bit on an unknown film from 1978's Superman, along with the usual expected ones of Jaws and Star Wars and a few others sprinkled in. Isaac, what have we got up next?
Well, we're gonna jump into 80s blockbusters, which is really, I mean, I think in a sense we really are out of the formative period and into a period where like that starts to really become the model, and it's, you know, it's going to be it's an interesting period. I mean, a lot of the franchises that we know today, I mean, you know, really come out of that period or are solidified during it, and it's also one where you've got certain dead ends, for instance, like the muscly action hero, which is sort of, you know, which is a big genre globally, but not so much in the United States anymore.
That was interesting because we were looking up, we're like, oh, where does like Commando fit in and Predator and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, oh, they don't. They're not that highly ranked year by year. Like they made money and you could call them a hit, but we're talking the blockbusters.
Yeah. They're not actually totally. It's weird to think of Schwarzenegger, like he's a hit maker, right?
Right.
And not only that, something like Conan, which we've covered, is deeply influential on lots of movies, on just the sword and sorcery explosion of the 80s, which is a big thing. But when you're talking about like the very top of the top, he doesn't have a lot that's in there. He has a few.
Yeah, it's really odd because the 80s, when you're looking at just like the top 10 films of the 80s, it's all Spielberg, Lucas. You've got Tim Burton coming in at the end in the 89 with Batman, and you've got Ghostbusters and Zemeckis with Back to the Future. Like it's the people that were like active. It's starting to be active at the late 70s, kind of, I don't want to say accidentally, but like kind of accidentally like invented this like type of film. And we're like, oh, okay, let's play with this. So like, it's like the cobbled together discovery that you've got in the 70s of like this blockbuster thing. And then it's like, oh, actually hitting those beats and telling these stories. And then also like, you know, the marketing takes over and the toys take over and everything else too. So it's an interesting time period to build off of from these like discoveries of the 70s. And now they're just like fully playing in what they know as blockbuster territory when you get to the 80s.
Yeah.
Going to be interesting. But before we sign off, we want to remind you politely, if you're interested or liking the show, be sure to rate and review in whatever podcast app you are using. And if you know somebody who might also be interested in hearing us yammer on a bit about the history and politics of the blockbusters, tell a friend or two about the show. We're up and running on the usual social media sites. So click on the links in the show notes to take you to the various platforms there. We're posting, mainly through the blockbuster stuff, a lot of like the trailers and the accessory stuff that goes with some of these blockbusters that are the ephemera, as it were, around these blockbusters throughout this series. So check out some of the stuff we're posting there. And until next time, I am Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And, you know, I always say this, stay safe out there. Stay psychologically safe, because as we you know, look, the majority of people are still not vaccinated, so there's that. But also for the vaccinated, you know, I'm noticing everybody I know is like really stressed out, and I think it's like the summer and things starting to open up and suddenly interacting with people, right? It's a lot. So be kind to yourself, open up to the world as you can or as you need to. Obviously, you know, work is one thing, but I mean the rest of the world. And yeah, you know, enjoy the sun.